Hello, this is Kyle, also known as AlienTube, and today I have a video about this LK Chen Dragon Sparrow Hidden Hilt Dao. Now, this sword is one of several that KK from LK Chen had sent to me as loaners to do videos on before moving them on to some other YouTubers or reviewers, or maybe back to LK Chen themselves. I'm not sure where they're going once I'm done with them. These swords have all made some rounds across multiple people who have had experience with them, probably put out videos. And because they've been shipped around quite a bit, they are all not pristine. The shipping is not pleasant for swords. We've all had that experience of UPS delivering a box that's just beat to hell. And that doesn't do that great of things to swords. So if there's little flaws in these swords, that's where I attribute most of that damage to shipping. That said, this one, not really the case, at least not that I've seen. Now, this sword sells new from LK Chen for $295, and shipping to the US is $70. Alternatively, you could buy it from Kult of Athena. They have it in stock as of recording, but their price is $358, not including shipping. And if they have to charge tax for you, it'll probably end up being a little bit more expensive from Kult of Athena. I'll put links in the description to the listings for both of them, direct from LK Chen and from Kult of Athena. The last thing about that is I believe Kult of Athena definitely has these in stock. I don't think LK Chen actually stocks them. I think when you place an order with them, they actually go and make it. So there's going to be more of a delay if you order from LK Chen, whereas Kult of Athena, you'll get it within a week or two, I would imagine. Now, as always with these videos, I know very little about Chinese swords and Chinese swordsmanship. I don't really know a lot about swordsmanship from any culture, but I at least have some idea of what I'm doing with European swords. When it comes to Chinese swords, I don't have any idea. So just keep that in mind. So we've got here a sword that fits into the scabbard. It's a wood scabbard with a couple bronze fittings on it, two mounting points, and quite a large shape here. And then the hilt, most of the hilt actually fits into the scabbard, hence the hidden hilt name. This part right here is kind of like the pommel. No, this ring part is the pommel, and this is like another added bit. Now, with this one, I have to yank it out of the scabbard pretty hard to get it to come out, but it does come out eventually, and there we go. Pretty compact single-edged sword, so it's a Dao. One interesting thing, I can never tell. There's no way to tell which way to insert the sword into the scabbard. If I put it in right, it slides right in. But if I put the edge the other way, it goes most of the way, and then it gets stuck right around there. I can never seem to remember that the edge goes away from the mount points, but I'm sure if I use the sword more and if I were wearing it, I would very quickly get used to it. It's just I haven't used it enough to make that second nature to me. Now, this sword is like most of LK Chen's swords, made of a pattern welded steel. They have the exact composition listed on their website, and I'll see if I can put it up here on screen as well. It's, as always with LK Chen, it's a really beautiful pattern and subtle. Most of the time, they don't over etch the blade so that it really pops out like that. You have to look kind of closely to see it on this sword and most of LK Chen's swords. Not all of them. I have seen some where the pattern is very bright. Now, before I start getting into my impressions of this sword and my thoughts on it, let's talk history and the context of what this sword came about, what was going on in China around the time frame that this sword would have been used. And that's not my area of expertise. So to help with that, here is Andy of...
Thank you so much, Alien Toot, for having me back on the channel to talk about this really cool Dao. Now, in order to properly set the background for it, we need to roll back the clock all the way to the Han Dynasty. So remember, the Han Dynasty is contemporaneous with the Roman Empire over in Europe, and it was unified before it becomes shattered again during the Romance of the Three Kingdoms era. And out of that warring state period, out of that chaotic time, it becomes unified again during the Jin dynasty. And here is a sword from that period made by swordmaker LK Chen. This is called the Scarlet Sunrise, a really pretty Jun, so a straight double-edged sword. So the Jin isn't able to hold on to all of China for a very long period of time, and very quickly it leads to infighting and many different contenders coming towards the throne. And unfortunately, in this period of time, which is called the Eight Princes period, someone gets the good idea to try and invite outside armies to come in and help bolster their forces. So they invite the nomadic armies in. Was this a good idea? Well, it's unfortunately called the era of the Five Barbarians. And so what happens is all of these armies that come in from the nomadic peoples of the steppe decide they instead want to go and have a chance to take over the throne of China, to take over the imperial throne. And they start carving up all of northern China. What remains of the Jin dynasty has to flee south, and just a remnant of it exists in the southern half of China, while the northern half of China ends up getting carved up into a whole bunch of little mini kingdoms and dynasties. And this sets the stage for this next period of time that we'll look at very briefly. So from the end of the Jin to the unification under the Sui dynasty, we have about a 300-year period where China is really in a state of turmoil, and it just constantly rolls over all the time. But we also end up with this big division of southern and northern. Just like we have stereotypes here in the United States of northern Yankees and good old southern boys, the same thing occurs in China. So northerners are associated with being better horsemen, with being very honest, with being very brash and headstrong and bold. And southerners are associated with being better boatsmen, better on the water, and being kind of soft and refined and very cunning, very sneaky. This is because of what was occurring all the way back then, almost 2,000 years ago, where the culture from the Jin dynasty was able to be held on to. There was turnover during this time where the dynasties rolled over, but it occurred mostly through kind of political intrigue and simple assassination, whereas the northern kingdoms were undergoing constant invasions and fighting and bloody sort of revolutions and wars. Eventually, out of all of this warring, we get consolidation in the north out of the Northern Wei dynasty. And it's during this time that the sword we're looking at today finally springs forth. Now, the sword features a very interesting mix of features from past and present designs. For instance, we're no longer seeing this this type of scabbard suspension that was seen as far back as the Han Dynasty, where we have a scabbard slide that's meant to be worn through the belt against the and worn kind of high in a high waist position. Instead, we now have a 2-point suspension that is meant to be worn suspended from straps hanging lower on the belt. This is something that we see in cavalry swords and was originally seen in Persia. So the Sassanid swords have these 2-point suspension systems, and this is an indication of trade that's occurring all the way across Central Asia, and is a feature that will be common on swords of the nomadic peoples across Central Asia for centuries and centuries to come. If we take a look at another type of Dao, this is a Dao from a later period, from the Song Dynasty, but something in common, again, all the way back through the Han period, is the ring pommel at the end. Now, in the Han period, much like this Dao, we have a tang that will go all the way to the end, and then attached, welded to it, will be a simple steel or iron ring pommel at the end. What's different in the case of the Dragon Sparrow Dao is we have a very ornate ring pommel at the end that's made of a softer metal. In this case, it's a cast bronze. That goes into the handle a little bit and is then pinned to the iron tang in the middle of the grip. And again, we start to see ornamentation being formed in the middle of it here. And there's a variety of different motifs that can go on. Some originals could be done of a variety of metals, could even have gilding on them. And we'll see different types of figures used from the Chinese zodiac and Chinese mythology. There's some indication from writings from the Sui and Tang dynasty that depending on what your military rank is, will depend on what type of character that you have inside. And these have knock on effects in neighboring areas in Asia. We'll see different types of patterns in Korea and even in Japan, where we have predilections for phoenix and dragon ring-hilted designs in the centuries to come. Um, Additionally, we have, if we look towards the blade end, gone are the kind of rounded features from the Han, and instead we have these very angular kind of chisel tip designs. While they may have been seen as far back as the Han, this is really where you see them kind of solidifying what the design is like, that will continue to go forward all the way through the Tang. Again, this is something that proliferates through other parts of Asia. We have surviving examples of swords contemporary with this example surviving in Japan. It's very rare to find surviving examples in China from this period. So LK Chen had to assemble this particular dragon sparrow sword from a variety of different finds. The hilt from one sword, the blade from another sword, in order to put this one together. Perhaps the most notable feature, however, is the actual part that gives it part of its name, the hidden hilt feature. It has no guard, and of course, the entire hilt assembly slides into the scabbard. Is that unknown throughout all of history? Well, even though we might not know exactly what its purpose is, we do see other swords that feature this type of design in different points in history. Most notably, in the the Eastern European peoples of the Caucasus Mountains. So, for instance, the Circassians and the mountain peoples of Georgia, swords like the shashka will have basically no type of crossguard and will have their entire hilt assembly slide into the scabbard when not in use and have to be withdrawn by grabbing the pommel portion of it. Now, these are a people that spend a lot of the time on horseback and will fire from horseback. So they're either using bows or using later long arms like muskets, and carry a great deal of their armament on their hips while they're on horse. That means that they can't afford to have a sword with a very large, earlier style medieval cross on it at their hip, and having it get snarled when they're trying to operate whatever type of missile weapon they have. Could this be why a sword like the Dragon Sparrow was not favored? For wouldn't have a design that would have a large cross to try and prevent it from being used. It's around this time that stirrups first came into use. They were developed in the earlier Jin, and so now you have much more time spent in the saddle, and you can have a different type of blade than the earlier, very long Han-style cavalry Dao. So you can have a shorter, more compact blade that can be a little bit more maneuverable, and now you can do things like archery from horseback more easily. Maybe that's why you have a blade that's completely devoid of crossguard, but it's just a theory. Anyway, back to you, Kyle.
Thanks for your contribution, Andy. I really appreciate it because it gives me more information about time frame, a time in history and a culture that I just know pretty much nothing about. I really appreciate it. For all my viewers, if you haven't checked out his channel, make sure you do so. I'll put a link in the description. So this sword, like Andy mentioned, it has much more of a chisel tip design than the rounded tip that you will oftentimes see on Dao that I associate with Dao, but there are a good number of different types of Dao that have that chisel tip. We've got a pretty short bevel from, it's a pretty robust blade with a pretty thick, a lot of distal taper, and then it has a very flat surface here, then a crisp line, and then the bevel towards the edge. And that bevel is very well done, very straight, very even. And let's see how the edge does on paper. Now keep in mind, this is not a new sword, so who knows what's been done to the edge. But this way, when you see some cutting footage from me, you'll have an idea of how sharp the sword is. All right, so it completely failed to bite into the paper there. That time it did bite in quite easily till it got to around here and then it started tearing. That's pretty much okay for me. I'm not going to cut with this part of the blade particularly, so it's not a big deal if this is a little bit less sharp. Yeah, so up in the primary cutting position, it seems quite effectively sharp. It gets a little bit sharper back, or less sharp back here. This sword does make a good amount of sword wind. Let me see if I can get it for you. Pretty sure you could hear that. I certainly can. Now, this is a robust sword, despite it being relatively short. Like I showed, it's quite thick, and it has a good amount of distal taper, but it stays pretty thick throughout. It weighs in at 1 pound, 13 ounces, or 830 grams, and you feel it. It's not a light sword. That doesn't mean it's not nimble. It's just not a light sword. It is balanced. Oh, that looks like about 4.5 to 5 inches out from the hilt, and there's no guard on here whatsoever. There's nothing to protect your hand from sliding up the blade, so you have to be really careful when using this. I would imagine some kind of lanyard or something to tie the pommel to your wrist would not go amiss with this sword, especially because the grip, while it's oval and it's generally a good shape, it's just bare wood, and it's very smooth bare wood. There's really not much to give my hand purchase on this sword. If I really grip it, you can see I can rotate it in my hand more than I would like. And when I was cutting with it, this became something of a problem for me. And to explain what I mean by that, I'm going to have to kind of give you an overview of how I've been trying to do cutting recently. And that's basically to accelerate the tip of the sword at the start of my movement by squeezing with my pinky, my ring finger, and some of my middle finger. It's a technique, from what I understand, is what's very commonly used with European sword techniques. So I start by doing that, and then I push the hand out, straight arm, try to get the sword out straight with my arm. Now, when I was doing this with this sword, it accelerates well, and I can get some good cuts with it. But I never feel like, when I'm doing that quick acceleration with the fingers, I never feel like I have a good grip on this sword. Every cut, I was like, this doesn't feel secure in my hand. So that tells me that's not the correct way to use the sword, right? You know, if the sword doesn't feel secure, that's not a good thing. So I then decide to switch to a more hammer grip and kind of try to do more draw cutting. And that worked somewhat. I can get a better grip on it, and it was able to get some cuts like this, but it just did not feel right to me. And that's probably more my technique and my familiarity with that technique. I don't know if that's correct. I don't know if you're supposed to do draw cuts with this sword, but with a locked in hammer grip. But it's the way that I did it that felt a little bit more secure in my hand. That's my technique, though. Again, I don't know Chinese swordsmanship at all, so I'm just kind of fumbling around here. But it did definitely feel a little bit better like that than trying to power it with my fingers. Now, a couple other just quick notes about this sword. Looking at the lengths of the planes of it, I see almost no rippling. There's a couple spots with very, very tiny ripples, but there's very, very little. And it's the least amount of rippling that I've seen on an LK Chen sword. Admittedly, the blade geometry is not particularly complex. It's mostly a flat surface here, although with the distal taper, there's definitely some complexity there. One thing I do really like about this The tip is quite agile. I can put the tip where I want to without much effort at all. Even with a 4.5, 5 inch point of balance, that's not something you would really consider to be normal for a thrusting sword, a sword that is going to be focused on nimbly delivering the tip wherever you want. But this is not bad at all. Something else, I know this is not the correct way to use a sword, but you absolutely, at least I absolutely can get two hands on here by using the pommel as kind of like half a grip there. And when I do this, the sword moves incredibly quickly, incredibly easily, but that's not the right way to use it. I don't know how well the pommel would hold up to the reverberations and being locked into the hand like that. That's not the right way to use it as far as I'm aware, so I don't think that it's something that you should do unless you really want to put the sword to the test. So in the end, this sword is around $360. That puts it kind of towards the high end of the budget range, in my opinion, where the budget range would generally be $400 or less. Is this sword worth that price? Well, for me, no, because I just don't feel like I have a good control over this sword. But I do really like the overall look, the fact that it kind of hides in the scabbard. That's a really cool feature that you don't see very often. And it's a really beautiful sword. It's nicely sharp. It cuts well. It doesn't really do it for me personally, but I do think the craftsmanship here is very good for the price. Just like pretty much is normal on all of LK Chen's stuff. If the sword that you're looking at from them speaks to you, it's almost definitely going to be worth the price. So while I wouldn't personally spend $360 on this sword, if this is a sword that you really like the look of, you think you would enjoy, and you think you know how to handle, and you do know how to handle, absolutely I do think it's worth it. But just not for me. And that's going to wrap up this review. I want to give a huge thank you once again to KK for allowing me to hold on to these swords for many, many months as I am able to get these videos out when I have the time. Also, a thank you to Andy from for his knowledge and the history of China and this sword. Again, if you haven't checked out his channel, make sure you do so. The link will be in the description. Until next time, Alien Toot out.